Larian, how dare you? How dare you update your game and give us new free content for your players? You'll never succeed in this quadruple A market like this. Don't you know this should be in a season pass? Come on! Okay, but seriously, Larian Studios, you are slowly becoming the gold standard for video game companies. Not one, but 8 free patches that don't just fix issues, but expand this masterpiece even further. It's amazing. It's incredible. But the video I made a few months back, Is Savage Attacker Worth It?, is now outdated. And honestly, it's garbage. The research I did was good, but the voice quality is terrible. There's an overly long introduction, and a couple of the patches have changed a few things. So you know what? Let's try this again. Savage Attacker is a feat in Baldur's Gate 3 which says, quote, "When making melee weapon attacks, you roll your damage dice twice and use the highest result." This sounds simple on paper, but it's a lot more nuanced than you'd think. Rolling a specific number on a single dice is determined by 1 over s, where s is the number of sides on the dice. In this game, you have dice with 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12 sides, and in many instances, you are rolling multiple per attack. Now, as a refresher, let's go over the base dice for each weapon category. Sickles, light hammers, daggers, and clubs all have a d4 damage dice. Hand axes, javelins, maces, scimitars, and short swords all have a d6 damage dice. Tridents, quarterstaffs, and spears are the first set of versatile weapons, and they use a 6-sided dice when one-handed and an 8-sided dice when two-handed. Great clubs, flails, morning stars, rapiers, and war picks all use an 8-sided damage dice. Battle axes, long swords, and warhammers all use a d8 when one-handed and a d10 when two-handed. Glaives, halberds, and pikes all have a d10 damage dice. Great axes have a d12 damage dice. And finally, greatswords and mauls both have 2 6-sided damage dice. There are other dice rolls which provide more damage, but I'll get into those in a bit. It's very easy to understand what the odds are when rolling a single dice. Every number has an equal chance of being rolled. But when you roll 2 dice and take the larger outcome, a few interesting patterns appear. Take, for example, a 6-sided dice. The average number rolled would be 3.5. You have an equal chance of getting more than that as you do less than that. When rolling 2 6-sided dice, you have 6 to the power of 2, or 36 outcomes. After a bit of calculation, you find that the new average outcome is 4.47. That is almost an entire ability score improvement from just a 6-sided dice. But if you examine a little more, you will notice this red square in the top left corner of all my charts. They all contain the lowest half of the outcomes in the original dice. Basically, the half of the dice that was considered below average becomes less frequent. Instead of a 50% chance, you have a 25% chance of rolling a below average number. This also comes with the higher numbers being more frequent. In fact, the highest number becomes the most common number and is nearly twice as likely to be rolled as it was without Savage Attacker. This is the actual benefit of Savage Attacker. Not just damage, but consistency. And getting mad at your dice a lot less often. That being said, you do still want to profit on damage compared to an ability score improvement. So only take it if your weapon is using a collective 8 sides worth in dice at least. Still following? Well, if you were paying attention earlier, I said that certain weapons roll 2 dice. Greatswords and mauls roll 2 d6s, not to be confused with a d12. 2 6-sided dice where you add the outcome has their average as 7, as opposed to 6.5. That and the other outcomes become less likely the further they are from the average. Basically, lower risk, lower reward. Now, what happens when you throw Savage Attacker in that mix? Suddenly, you now have 4 dice that you're rolling, meaning you have 1,296 outcomes. That's a big number. Keep in mind, this is not just the odds of d6 stacked on top of itself. No, you are rolling every damage dice twice and taking the highest result of each. Notice a few key differences. The odds of rolling 2 6s, the maximum damage, goes from 2.7% to 9.3%. The odds of rolling the minimum damage, 2 1s, goes from 2.7% to less than 0.1%. And the most common number is not the max number like before. It becomes 9. Now I also want to bring attention to standard deviation. Standard deviation is a statistic that helps show how much the data is spread out. Like, if you were given a set of numbers, but all you know about them is that the mean is 20, were the data points between 17 and 23, or were the data points between 0 and 40? Mean alone can't tell us that, but standard deviation can. Standard deviation is calculated so that 66% of data points are within one standard deviation from the mean, 33% above the mean, and 33% below the mean. Two standard deviations contain 96%. This means that 48% of all data points would be above the mean as well as below the mean. Anything outside of that second standard deviation only happens approximately 4% of the time. 2% of the time it's above the mean, and 2% of the time is below the mean. The reason why I'm bringing up standard deviation after two 6-sided dice weapons is because of how low the standard deviation is compared to the other charts. Not only do these weapon types have the highest average damage by default, both before and after Savage Attacker, but its standard deviation is lower than both the 10-sided dice and the 12-sided dice. Basically, the original mean was 7 damage, but now the mean is 8.8. However, the median number is still 9, so you will still get 9 or higher over 50% of the time. Meanwhile, going off on what I mentioned earlier, the odds of getting 4 damage or less has only about a 2% chance of happening with the Savage Attacker feat, as opposed to the 16.16% it was originally. Greatswords and Mauls benefit more than any of the other weapon classes in the game with Savage Attacker, getting an effective 2 ability score improvements worse in damage. Okay, so all of what I just said is just the base damage. There are countless weapons and abilities in the game that give you additional dice. Heck, there are so many weapons that just have additional dice that I don't even have time to say all of them. You could find a dozen of them just by going through the game blind. And then there's some equipment that give you additional dice, like the Infernal Gauntlets, and there are spells like the Crusader's Mantle. But that's not all. Some classes have unique attacks that add additional dice. Fighters have the Superiority dice from the Battlemaster subclass. Paladins have their ever so iconic Smites. Bards among the College of Swords have Flourishes. Barbarians get a new subclass in patch 8, which gives them an additional d6 of elemental damage when raging. And clerics that aren't of the light or knowledge domain gain the Divine Strike ability at level 8, adding a d8 damage to your weapon. This does not, however, work with unarmed attacks. Rest in peace to monks. But then paradoxically, this does work with thrown weapons that have the thrown property. I don't think that it should be considered a melee attack once it leaves your grip, but hey, more power to you. This is also another reason to use it with the new Barbarian subclass, which gives every weapon the thrown property. And finally, as of patch 7, sneak attacks now work with this feat. More on that later. You probably noticed I've mentioned ability score improvement a few times. That is because this is the benchmark feat that every other ability gets compared to. It affects damage, accuracy, armor, and a bunch of other stat-related abilities. Savage Attacker, to its credit, can consistently surpass the damage from an ability score improvement, and be better depending on your setup. Then you have potions and equipment that can set your stats to completely cover up the downside of Savage Attacker, leaving several feats open. But other than ability score improvement, what about the other feats and abilities? Alert is pretty much a must-have on at least half of your characters, and all of the half feats have their own merit, providing an ability and a stat point to help you round out an odd stat. But among the feats that deal with damage, there is one feat that stands as the reigning king. Great Weapon Master. If you are two-handing a weapon, Great Weapon Master comes with a toggleable feature that trades in 5 in your attack roll for a 10-point damage boost. As if that wasn't insane enough, if you kill something or land a crit, you can attack again with your bonus action. That is a significantly higher damage boost than Savage Attacker. However, Savage Attacker's benefit is consistent damage. Great Weapon Master comes with less consistency, and thus relies on improvements to your ability score in order to be accurate. This makes Great Weapon Master good against enemies with low armor, but when you're up against a boss and you have to toggle Great Weapon Master off in order to land a single hit, having an ability like Savage Attacker to not have the minimum damage show up when you least want it can be a lifesaver. This creates a helpful and interesting balance between these two feats. Or at least it would if there wasn't an ability that did almost the same thing as Savage Attacker. Some martial classes come with fighting styles to give you abilities that work with certain weapon categories. Among them is an ability given to fighters and paladins called Great Weapon Fighting. What this does is if you roll a 1 or a 2 for your damage dice when you're two-handing a weapon, you can re-roll that damage dice. This works on all the same dice that Savage Attacker does, by the way. This is a worse version of Savage Attacker, but it doesn't waste a feat slot, and that's really important. And considering that most damage riders that aren't class specific are D6 or D4, Great Weapon Fighting is going to get a lot of mileage. Great Swords and Mauls especially will make great use out of it to the point where Savage Attacker is unnecessary. The difference is far more noticeable the higher the dice, like on Great Axes on account of them being a D12, but you still have Great Weapon Master to make up for the damage. Basically, Savage Attacker works best on great weapons, but it's also the most overshadowed in this category. I also want to bring up Barbarians here because they don't get a fighting style. Also, they save an entire feat slot by getting Alert for free at level 7. But 2 levels in Fighter is honestly better than 11 or 12 in Barbarian 90% of the time. So if you're using Great Weapons as a level 2 Fighter, level 10 Barbarian, Great Weapon Fighting might just be better than Savage Attacker in that regard. Now, you could combine the abilities if you have a fear of low numbers. Great Weapon Fighting and Savage Attacker being used together would mean that if one of the dice from Savage Attacker was rolled as a 1 or a 2, then it would be re-rolled. Only one of the dice from Savage Attacker can be re-rolled from Great Weapon Fighting, but you are still rolling your dice 3 times here. Like, hypothetically, let's say you attack with a Greatsword. The first dice that you roll has a 1 in 3 chance of being 2 or lower. If that happens, then the fighting style activates, and you have a 1 in 3 chance of getting that again. Then the second dice from Savage Attacker gets rolled, and it does not get re-rolled if it's a 1 or a 2. With 3 dice rolls, the odds of that 6-sided dice being a 1 or 2 goes from 33% to 3.7% chance. However, you still have a second dice. Yeah, the odds of you rolling both 6-sided dice as a 2 or lower with the Great Weapon Fighting style and the Savage Attacker feat is 1 in 729, 0.13%. The original odds of getting a 2 or lower with one of these two abilities was 2%. It's literally 15 times as unlikely now. If you are planning to combine these two abilities, which isn't even a bad idea, then the weapons that have the 2 6-sided dice will see the greatest effect. I've been talking a lot about great weapons because those are the weapons that make the best uses out of Savage Attacker. But Savage Attacker isn't exclusive to those weapons. Smites, maneuvers, flourishes, and other damage riders are all the same regardless of the weapons that they're used with. And when you remove Great Weapon Master and Great Weapon Fighting from the equation, Savage Attacker becomes an incredible option when enhancing your damage. Basically, this is one of the best feats to use with one-handed, dual-wielding, or shield users. Fighters and bards benefit with Savage Attacker because they can make any martial weapon surpass the two-handed weapons very easily. But paladins are the best martial class to pair with this feat. Smites, specifically Divine Smite, get a D8 in damage per level, all the way up to level 4. That is 4 to 32 extra damage. Double for undead. Now, paladins can't even reach level 4 smites on their own in Baldur's Gate 3, but a warlock or bard multiclass can each have up to at least 5 tier 4 smites per long rest. Or if you take paladin to level 11, every attack, smite or not, just gets an extra D8 holy damage because who cares? You know what? Screw Great Weapon Master. This is just better for paladins. Dooley in the editing room here. I completely forgot to include Booming Blade in this section. This is a cantrip introduced in patch 8 that is treated as a melee attack. At the earliest levels, it has an effect that if the target moves, they take sunder damage. This by itself is not relevant to Savage Attacker, but at level 5, your weapon attack gets an additional D8 damage rider. Using this with a club will still net you more damage with Savage Attacker than it would with an ASI. But then at level 11, it gets a second D8 damage rider. Sure, it's once per turn, but it doesn't waste resources and you still have a second attack. Enjoy the new level 1 dip bonus. Remember how I said the old video was outdated? Ladies and gentlemen, Savage Attacker Rogue. As of patch 7, sneak attacks now benefit from Savage Attacker. Sneak attack gains an additional d6 every 2 levels in Rogue. At level 4, you will have an additional 2d6 to your sneak attack, and a 3d6 at level 5, which will be more than the base damage of any weapon. This is meant to be a substitute for extra attack on rogues, and now that statement actually makes sense. This also combos perfectly with the new subclass of Swashbuckler. You no longer need to have an advantage for sneak attacks. Also, people you attack can't make opportunity attacks against you. Also, levels in Rogue increases your initiative. Yeah, I'm sold. You know exactly why this combo works. Also, there are 3 versatile finesse weapons in the game, so you can totally use great weapon fighting with or in place of Savage Attacker. That being said, I prefer Savage Attacker because it rerolls no matter what. This also is the best case for when using a two-handing weapon. You would rather have Savage Attacker over Great Weapon Master. Sneak attacks already have massive damage, but you do not want to miss, meaning Great Weapon Master could cause more harm than good, even if you multi-class into an extra attacker. Speaking of, extra attack is such a funny interaction with the assassin subclass. Normally, if you attack someone and they try to arrest you, you can select the attack dialog and then you would start combat with a used action. If another ally attacks the person who is arresting you, combat will start immediately. Then the first attacker will have their action restored, and the new attacker will have used their action. If we run through the same example, but with extra attack, if an extra attacker starts combat by attacking someone or resisting arrest, that will count as their action, but they will still be able to use a second attack when their turn comes. If the second character attacks the guard, the same rules will apply to them if they have extra attack, but the first ally gets their action restored, while they still have a spare attack. When it's their turn, they get 3 attacks, in addition to the attack that triggered the arrest. You can do this with multiple guards at once. Combat will only start when one of them is hit a second time, so set this up wisely. Assassins have the funny ability to restore an action upon entering combat. Someone tries to arrest them for murder, that's fine, I got another action with your name on it. Mix that with extra attack at level 8, and the example I gave earlier applies here as well. 1 attack pre-arrest, the second attack from extra attack, and 2 more from the restored action. This can also come with the bonus of being able to use sneak attack twice, once out of combat and once in combat, because someone must have glossed over that line of code. Then you have Druid. Sweet mother of America. Of all the classes that would utilize this feat and run with it, I did not expect it to be this one. First off, the Circle of the Moon Druid gains an interaction at level 10, where Wild Shaping grants you 4 Myrmidon forms, 3 of which wield weapons. Weapons where Savage Attacker can make a difference. Essentially, your average damage is going to increase by more than 2 in most cases, and will consistently be above average as previously mentioned. And unlike Tavern Brawler, this actually works in Honor mode. Then you have Spore Druid. At level 2, they gain an ability that gives them an additional 6-sided necrotic damage dice for a wild shape charge. And that damage doubles if you have Halo of Spores active. And last, but absolutely not least, you have the Druid's unique spell, Flame Blade. It can also be achieved by one of the Tiefling subraces as well, but that can't be upcasted. A level 2 spell that summons a curved sword that does fire damage. This doesn't function like a normal one that does a singular d6 damage. This does 3 d6 damage, with an additional d6 every 2 levels. If you don't know why 5d6 is cracked with this feat, You weren't paying attention. It can be dual wielded, by the way. Martial Druids are an extremely funny build, and I think people should try it at least once. I mean, come on, Jaheira is right there. Duly back in the editing room, Flameblade has some competition. Remember that ring you got from Arabella in Act 2? You can actually unlock that spell. Shadowblade does a 2d8 upon unlocking it, and increases by a d8 every 2 spell levels, totaling up to 48 at level 5. That's already more damage than with Flameblade, but it can be doubled with the Resonance Stone, and it also lasts until long rests. So this can be even more useful for your melee character, especially if they have Savage Attacker. In conclusion, Savage Attacker is an overall niche feat. Any melee build can make use of it, but the more dice, the better. It won't always provide the best damage, but it will always keep your numbers from being too low. That is where Savage Attacker shines. Not just as an increase in damage, but consistency for damage. Consistency in a game with so much luck can mean the difference between winning or losing a fight. And that is why I think Savage Attacker is a good feat and is worth trying. It's also a feat that helped me in my honor mode run, so you know what? I'm probably biased. Anywho, I hope someone found this video helpful, and if you did, leave a like and subscribe. I've been using this channel as a creative outlet for making guides for problems that I had in these games, and if you are still here, I hope you have a nice day. Goodbye!